Hey, wanna know a secret? Steven Universe saved my life, and I'm gonna try and tell you how. I thought I would have stopped talking about the show by now, but no. I find that the older I get, the more I relate to this show, and I do pride myself on being self-aware, but I can't help but find the title of this video to be so corny. I'm on my Drake era right now. The show covers themes of change, mental illness, relationships, and I never took note of it when I was younger, but looking back, I'm impressed by how when I was a kid, I took note of them on a surface level. But it's only now that I've lived life a bit, I have so much more appreciation for it. I'm sure this will do wonders for the retention of the video, but this is more of an audio experience. It won't have the edits my usual videos have. If you want weird edits, there's plenty more of that on my channel, just not here. We're trauma dumping today, but doing it in a tasteful and personable way. Of course, when it comes to videos like this one, there are issues. Issue number 1, my personal issues. This video is about me, it's my channel. There are trans issues explored in the show, but I'm not gonna talk about them because I'm not trans. Non-binary sure, but I'm not gonna talk about issues that I can't speak from because I'm not a part of that group. Issue number 2. There are 3 pillars of the show that I'm going to talk about. How am I going to talk about it? The video is split into 4 parts. The intro, base show, movie, and future. You can skip to whatever part you want to, I can't control you, but issue number 3. I'm still learning. I'm a completely different person now from who I was a year ago. And inevitably, that's going to keep happening. Believe it or not, I'm going to learn more, and my perspectives are going to change in the future. If anything, this video is like a little time capsule, and I'm simply inviting you to pick my brain with me. While we all unite under the umbrella of talking about one of the greatest Cartoon Network shows of all time. Issue number 4. I know that some people don't like the show and they're valid for that opinion. I acknowledge the many pitfalls of the show, but it doesn't detract from my experiences I've had because of it. And I'm not objectively saying it's the greatest show ever. If you're gonna comment telling me about how bad the show is, feel free to do so, but that's not the main point of the video. Steven is the main character of the show, and we almost exclusively follow him, which in retrospect kind of made the show worse off. But the silver lining to it was that we always saw these characters through an innocent, childlike lens. And it's genuinely incredible how the show created a narrative around Pink Diamond. Titular protagonist Steven has a character arc of initially being a blank slate, like how everyone's a blank slate, then is gradually stripped of innocence as everyone in his life is traumatized and affected by the epitome of evil. Rose quartz. I don't actually mean that. My opinion on Rose is really strange, and it could be a 20-minute video on its own. But by the end of the franchise and future, it's a congregation of a lot of hurt people. There are videos out there talking about everything Rose did, and they turn her actions into a straw man for why the show is bad as a whole. Like, I'm entirely convinced that an underlying theme in the show that isn't talked about that often is the idea of generational trauma and how it goes from one generation to the next, and how each character doesn't really handle it in the correct way. Not that there is one definitive way, but some ways are worse than others. This comes to a head in the dynamic duo of Rose Quartz and Greg. If you watched Steven Universe Future, you'd know that Greg came from a conservative background that restricted his freedoms, this leading Greg to ultimately rebel and leave his family behind. I haven't seen it be talked about at all yet, but Greg's family dynamic is definitely a parody of Pink's family dynamic, and it's comical because while everyone berates Pink for leaving her family behind, Greg pretty much did the exact same thing, even changing his name. Now you have to take into account that Pink Diamond going and starting a rebellion and causing the death of thousands of gems is different from Greg being a rock star and destroying his family's heirloom. But these two characters embody rebellion, and their response to their trauma impacts Steven's life substantially. Greg having a structured life led to him giving Steven a comical amount of freedom, which can be conflated for neglect, to be honest.
I grew up in a van!
And Rose is honestly just an avoidant, and her solution to her problems is to run away, and to neglect how her actions impact other people, which hurts because I've been on the receiving end of that before. I find that there's an evergreen message in the show about patience and the importance of giving a second chance, while at the same time being thoughtful and aware of whatever you're faced with. This being embodied in the character of Steven. While it's important to hold Rose accountable for what she did, there is a reason why she developed being avoidant of conflict. She had a family who treated her like crap and drove her to the point of taking her own death. And here's the fun part. I spent a lot of 2022 looking at psychology to better understand myself. And I'm not qualified in anything, but Rose was driven to that point because she didn't matter. Nothing she did changed her family's opinion. And her voice wasn't heard, leading her to leave, which is the healthiest solution, leaving a toxic situation. But the way she did it wasn't healthy at all, and it resulted in her being the de facto bad guy of the entire franchise. And it's ironic because the family dynamic of the Diamond seeped its way into Steven's life, where Steven's a parallel of Pink Diamond in his own family. I hold the belief that your past haunts you if it goes unaddressed. I think coming to peace with your past is incredibly important, and I really only came to peace with my past in the past month and a half. The difference between good and bad people is that bad people don't care enough to get better, and Greg isn't a bad person because his idea of change was him treating some differently from how he was treated, but you can tell he hasn't reached inner peace with himself, because he still vehemently defended his parenting strategy, even when Steven confronted him about how it was damaging. This showing a lack of maturity. What gives me so much appreciation for this show is that Greg's lack of maturity is shown throughout the entire series, but it's only in future that we are given a reason for why he acts the way he does, which makes everything a lot more comprehensible, to be honest. And to an extent, Greg is also an avoidant of his trauma, because he wasn't able to see the light and having structure in his son's life. Nothing in life is black and white. To elaborate on what I said earlier on, Steven Universe preaches understanding and sympathy, which has been something I've really tried to incorporate into my life. And I found that with trauma, it isn't really black and white, and moving past it without processing it often does more damage than good. Just to be a bit anecdotal, after the end of a relationship I had in 2018, I ended up being really destructive and committing a lot of self-sabotage, which I spent a lot of time trying to rectify, and it was only in late 2021 that I was able to move past it. And I believe that the non-linear narrative of this show was incredible, because we saw the reverse redemption arc of Pink Diamond. And it's ironic because Steven as a character is all about forgiveness and change, yet the story beats contradict that so much. And this was irrespective of Rose trying to change after the war, because we're repeatedly reminded in season 1 that Rose was a benevolent leader, and then that image is deconstructed and challenged over the course of the show, resulting at the end of the movie, where we all just collectively acknowledge that the actions of Pink Diamond really just messed everyone up. And then Future has so much nuance to it that isn't really talked about or appreciated, because it came at a crucial point in my life where I needed it. I'll save that for a bit though, but for now. So I briefly covered themes of the main show in the introduction. Themes of family, I touched on generational trauma and how it impacted Steven, but on the outlook, Steven Universe the show is really innocent. There are deeper themes covered in the base show, but Steven the character doesn't really explore them that much. The audience would, and we did. We got to see the abusive relationship in Malachite, literally a trauma bond where the two argue about getting back together on a ship, and I watched it when I was like 12 and I thought, haha, that's so dumb. But then now I think back on it and I'm like, wow, I feel so much differently now that I'm older and I've grown and I've been through more. I find that abusive relationships aren't really explored that much in media. I mean, sure, they are there, but I find the Steven Universe example of personifying it in a fusion to be really intuitive and a good example of showing rather than telling. A fusion is basically an analogy for a relationship, and the better the two are connected, the more stable it is. You have garnet being fused for a long time, you have the crystal gems fusing in alexandrite and obsidian, and there's just a lot of fusion in the show. But alexandrite isn't a stable fusion at all, and it falls apart whenever they aren't in sync, which I find interesting because obsidian's got 5 people compared to alexandrite's 4. But malachite was fused for a long time, which would make you think it's healthy, right? No. It was a hostage situation and about control, and the two were trapped with each other. It was a trauma bond, where the two were bonded together and they can't really leave, and nor did they want to, but it wasn't a healthy connection. Does that make sense? My bad if I didn't word it correctly, but if you've ever been in a trauma bond to anyone, it kind of hits home. I felt that Malachite was handled in a really healthy way, because Lapis had the fusion with Jasper, and then after that she spent time with Steven and Peridot, and then understood what a healthy relationship was, and then after that, no longer needed Jasper. I find it funny how I talked about Malachite first. I think that Steven Universe has a cast of broken people who are helped by Steven, which helps him heal from their trauma. And it's crazy because you almost forget that Steven is like 14 and he's doing all of this emotional labor. Everything from Lars and Sadie to the crystal gems dealing with the loss of Rose, Greg and Pearl's dynamic, and overall Steven the character was used as a therapist in the initial show. And Steven is incredibly mature. In the episode The Test, Steven finds out that the moon goddess statue was from a mission that didn't really matter that much, and the gems used that mission to test Steven's abilities, which he failed, leading Steven to demand a tougher test. You know, moral of the story is that Steven went through a giant test which was meant to be deadly, but he found out that it wasn't actually deadly at all, and the gems just used it to boost Steven's confidence. Steven was really upset by finding out that he was lied to twice and he was going to blow up, but he heard the gems talk about how they didn't really know what they were doing, and they were trying their best. And you know, there's a lot of maturity in being lied to twice, and still deciding to brush it aside and hug them like nothing happened. This is just one example of Steven time and time again choosing to be the bigger person. And from the beginning, Steven had a lot to live up to, as Rose was a leader. And over again, Steven had to deal with the outbursts of those around them who dealt with Rose. Whether it be Amethyst turning into Rose to mess with Greg, Garnet not knowing how to be a leader in Rose's absence, and just about everything dealing with Homeworld. Steven the character dealt with a lot and rose to the occasion each and every time, practicing sympathy. And they went through a period of taking responsibility for everything his mother did, and I noticed that happened after the Bismuth special, that episode being really crucial in showing Steven's character, because even when he's been a target, he's always willing to give a second chance. I know the term is a big joke at this point, but Steven's an empath, and no matter how many times he's been wrong, he tries time and time again to reach out and help. And this is epitomized in Jasper. Jasper is a character who benefits from the homeworld hierarchy, because even if she's a soldier, she's one of the best and she was genetically engineered to be the upper echelon of homeworld muscle. The Crystal Gems is a ragtag group of gems who were suppressed by homeworld and left for freedom. The reason why Peridot and Lapis joined was because they weren't free on homeworld. But then you have Jasper who lives for fighting and loves her life. How do you go about persuading a character like that? You don't. In The Return, the means of communication Jasper used were aggressive and blunt, and Jasper didn't allow Stephen the opportunity for him to rub off on Jasper. And then every other time we saw Jasper after that, she was intent on doing damage, and her actions were out of spite of Stephen. Then at Jasper's corruption, her entire monologue was banging the money about how Rose was manipulative about adopting gems into the Crystal Gems after they've lost everything. And her entire speech was true because Stephen did that exact same thing. And you could argue about there being a choice between the Crystal Gems or siding with homeworld. This being seen in Peridot and Lapis. Peridot had no other option. And Lapis had no other option either because she was imprisoned in homeworld anyway. Jasper is the perfect opposition to Stephen's mentality, and I'll talk more about it when I'm talking about the future. But Stephen's mentality is kind of weird because he's a nice guy that takes advantage of gems with nothing, and if they decline him and the Crystal Gems beat them up till they have nothing. Like, there's a reason why Citrine and Aquamarine wanted nothing from Stephen. It's because they weren't desperate and deprived of every other option.
I bet you don't really want to hurt us. You probably just act mean because deep down you're afraid you're weak. Go ahead, let it out. We're all sharing right now.
This scene right here just proves my point. Like, Stephen, it comes off really predatory and manipulative to like go up to a random gem you don't know at all and like try to extrapolate their entire life story. Like, is he projecting? Why? It doesn't work either, which I find really funny. To be honest, like, I kind of just find that Jasper had a really valid point against Stephen, and it doesn't contribute that much to the video, but I adore how the show will actively challenge the main character. And in a show where everyone gets redeemed, it's really valuable and important that not everyone can be saved by Stephen. Stephen has an inherent need to help people become better, and if he can't help people become better, it haunts him, even if the people he tries to help don't want help. It can be perceived as a need to be helpful or need to be liked. I kind of dealt with a similar thing when I was younger. It's a really important part of life to recognize that not everyone is going to like you or want to be your friend. No matter how forgiving you are, some people just aren't gonna be receptive, and in that exact same vein, you don't have to forgive anyone for anything, and I've really taken that to heart recently. Throughout my entire childhood and until like April 2022, I had the idea in my mind that in order to move on, you had to forgive someone for what they did. It's just not true. People conflate the idea of forgiveness with being at peace with yourself, and you can heal and not forgive. Sometimes you can't forgive because the actions are just that bad. Also, don't forget that some abusive people just apologize to get peace of mind, and you don't have to forgive them if you don't want to. Stop feeling pressure to. It's an entire narrative that abusers use to get away with things they've done. Steven Universe does an alright job of showing how everyone in the show is hurt, and the characters are three-dimensional. I put it down to corporate decisions, but the diamonds could have been developed more. We got a glimpse into their problems in the last episode, but I really would have liked to see it hinted at or shown earlier in the show. Yellow, Blue and White dealt with the death of Pink Diamond in very different ways, all of which being unhealthy. Blue Diamond mourned the death of Pink a lot and holds on to the past. This being seen in her preserving the zoo and her liking Greg and giving him the time of day. Yellow Diamond confronts emotion by trying to obliterate the past and focusing on the future. She doesn't run from her past, but she definitely runs away. Yellow is highly focused on destroying Earth and was incredibly blunt towards Peridot. She is avoidant of emotions in a very conceivable way and attacks problems with aggression. To be honest with you, I think that Blue Diamond is worse than Yellow. She was only receptive to the idea of Pink Diamond and was diametrically opposed to Pink Diamond not being who she was expected to be, and Pink was actively punished for being herself, leading her to feel trapped, hence why she left. The speech that Yellow gave in Change Your Mind was insightful into their family dynamic, which was basically White being the subjective character, who had tunnel vision on exclusively what she wanted. Her power is an extension of that. I love how in Change Your Mind, White Diamond was so direct and challenging everything Stephen believed in. Stephen stood for individuality and freedom. White Diamond stood for conforming and perfection. Then White Diamond made a comment about Stephen encouraging others to be imperfect, so he could be the best of the worst. Unpacking that, I found that to be really interesting, because that was definitely a thing. Rose Quartz led a rebellion and made everyone in the rebellion conform to her belief system. She stood for freedom but also enforced the idea of being a pacifist and not shattering anyone. And whenever she was opposed, she bubbled and muted them. Like, Pink is a reflection of White, and it's insinuated on the diamond emblem. It's generational trauma, and Pink did a lot of damage. Maybe not as much as White, but Pink's damage is rightly called out. The last portion of season 5 is everyone dealing with the Pink Diamond baggage, Steven being the central point and being challenged on his identity. Throughout the entire show, Steven's identity was being challenged and warped, as characters around him had expectations for who he was. Rose, Pink, or Steven? It's believable that Steven always knew he was himself, but there was definitely doubt that was exploited by White Diamond, resulting in the Change Your Mind Steven fusion. While being beautiful, the scene was executed poorly in my opinion. The fact that Pink's gem rotates between Rose, Pink, and Steven shows that Rose and Pink are still alive, and Steven is just the chosen form, which insinuates that Steven isn't entirely his own person. I mean, he isn't, because he has empathy powers, and I always interpreted them as Steven being able to sympathise with others to an extreme degree, as seen with Lars. I thought that Steven was just able to put himself in his mother's shoes because that was a part of his toolset, but White made it out that Pink was still alive in Steven, and that's why he had his mother's memories. Steven's identity constantly being questioned has been rightly called out for being an allegory for being trans, which I do understand, and while I personally don't relate to it, the song at the end of Change Your Mind is really heartwarming and empowering, and promotes loving yourself. To quote it, I don't need you to respect me, I respect me. I don't need you to love me, I love me. But I want you to know you can know me if I change your mind. I'm not gonna sing it. Anyway, I interpret everything with Homeworld being about challenge and bigotry, and I know in the original show, redeeming the diamonds in the last episode is really flawed when you think about it, but the show barely showed anything relating to the war, and I more so interpreted the diamonds committing genocide as a really hyperbolic metaphor for abuse. Steven Universe explores a reality that hurt people can easily hurt other people as a result of their personal pain, and how it explores generational trauma, and how it isn't black and white at all. There are a minuscule amount of parents that have the intention of being bad people. A vast majority think that what they're doing is best for their children, and even if it isn't, it's not black and white. Steven Universe is an incredibly idealistic show, and while Change Your Mind was debatably rushed for the purpose of having an extravagant finale, it had to have a happily ever after, and it sucks because it obviously isn't a happily ever after. Gosh, I want to explore the idea of how a happily ever after is toxic.
Here we are in the future. Here we are in the future and it's bright. Nothing to fear, no one to fight.
Steven Universe the movie is good, although it is criticised for redeeming the villain, Spinel. I watched this movie when I was like 15, and here I am being older. This movie resonated with me back then, and I still love it equally as much, and it really helps shape the overall Steven Universe franchise experience. I won't go as in depth, as the movie is a fraction of the length of the original show. Steven is low-key arrogant in this movie, and a critique of the original show is that Steven is always kind, and willing to give second chances, and the fandom really wanted to see a villain just stay a villain for once. You can tell that Steven in this movie is tired of the constant emotional labor he went through as a child. He is visibly scundered as he keeps mentioning his happily ever after being ruined. And the characterization in the movie isn't completely accurate to what it was in the base show, but thinking about it, there was a 2-year time skip, so obviously Steven changed physically and mentally, and randomly having everything go wrong 2 years deep into your quote-unquote happily ever after obviously would annoy you. And personally, whenever you think you've processed trauma, having it pop up again can be frustrating to deal with, considering you thought it was all over and done with. Steven becomes more and more self-aware over the course of the movie, and one of the final lines is the most impactful in my opinion. But then we've got to deal with Spinel, who I'm going to talk about the most because she is the central point of the movie, and isn't it in future that much. Spinel's character was handled incredibly, and it ties in well to the themes of the show. Steven Universe, the IP, is basically about the absence of Rose and how it affects everyone. Obviously there is more to it, but it all ties back to Rose when all is said and done. Spinel being a character who was left in a garden for 6,000 years and was abandoned by Pink as she moved on completely. Pink Diamond intentionally left Spinel behind because she felt as if she'd grown beyond the point of needing Spinel. This being really gross and selfish of Pink to do, because Spinel thought it was a game. It wasn't. You'd think that Pink would have came back for Spinel in the war, but no, Spinel just stayed there. Whether or not that was intentional or Rose forgot is up to interpretation, but part of me wants to believe that Rose completely forgot. Regardless of intention, it was terrible for Spinel to be left in the garden, but if Rose intended to come back to recruit Spinel, it would have shown good intention, but due to Rose's lack of self-awareness, she just forgot, which to me would be effective at showing the immaturity of Rose and how her lack of thought drastically affects those around gender, and how unawareness doesn't excuse doing bad things, which is also a really important lesson, I feel. Anyway, I relate heavily to the issues of abandonment that Spinell felt, and Spinell was genuinely valid for her visceral reaction to everything changing. Just to give an insight into me, one of my best friends at the time left the country when I was like 9, and I thought they were gonna come back, and I waited and waited, and they never did. Obviously, the situation has got more to it that isn't relevant to the video, but when you're waiting for someone who isn't gonna come back for you, it stunts your growth, and you often begin processing loss after the damage has already been done. This can be said for relationships too, and why ghosting can be really dangerous to deal with, because at least whenever someone leaves you because they're dead, there is closure. Whenever you get ghosted by someone important, you don't know if they're going to come back, and the possibility of them coming back is what's hard to deal with, and you're waiting for a day that might never ever come. The song Drift Away really struck a chord with me, because there's been a lot of occasions where I felt as if I've been left behind by people in my life. A critique of the movie that I've heard is that it was stupid for Spinell to stand there for 6,000 years without question, but I feel that that stupidity is just Spinell being naive, which if you've been abandoned by someone after you realize you were abandoned, you reflect and realize you were being naive. Spinell standing still for that long is just hyperbole of a real life situation. I love how Steven Universe, the movie, gets this fictional idea of a happily ever after and subverts traditional media in that no, it's not permanently fine. The original show ended on a happily ever after note, but when you think about all the plot points that were left unfinished, it's obvious that no, not everything is finished. And this critique in the fandom being addressed in the movie shows that the crewniverse were self-aware. The self-awareness being pointed out by Steven when he asks Spinell about him reliving all of his trauma, and then Spinell points out that singing isn't going to fix anything. It's ironic because it may look like singing fixed everything, but that song was the straw on the camel's back in terms of actually fixing the situation. Fix in quotation marks. Overall, the climax at the top of the injector was really impactful. I'm gonna have to give a bit of exposition here, but in the movie the gems are reset to factory default, and they get brought back to normal via like a little key, a key being memory. A certain experience kind of rejots their memory and makes them come back to normal. And Steven, he tries everything and he cannot get back to his regular self, and he's still powerless until the injector scene, where Steven, on the cusp of death, reflects and stops having tunnel vision and realizes that his key is that he changed and evolved, which he kind of stopped doing since the end of Change Your Mind. Then the song changes, Steven reaffirming his philosophy that he believes people can change for the better. And it is never too late to give up on someone. At the time the movie came out, I was going through a lot emotionally from when I was younger, and having Steven reaffirm the idea of change resonated with me because it let me know that I had to forgive myself for my past at one point. And even though I didn't do anything overly egregious, learning the lesson and not repeating it was the best I could do, and you're defined by your past. The entire movie is really on the nose with the message of change, and Steven literally says he never wants things to change, and then straight after, everything changes. You can record his character arc throughout the movie, and it caps off with Steven saying,
"There's no such thing as happily ever after. I'll always have more work to do."
which I genuinely love as a message, because if you've had any goal in life, it is so incredibly easy to complete that goal and become complacent in where you are. This is what Steven went through with his goal of restoring peace, and it's so validating to have this problem addressed, whereas in most media it's ignored. This goes on to establish that in future, whenever everything's said and done, it's said that everyone is still working to better themselves. I blame the media I've consumed growing up for this, but I have this habit of becoming lazy and complacent whenever I achieve a goal, and it's only after watching this movie that I realised that the work never really ends, does it? Like, as I'm making this video, I'm also working to better myself. I read a few books in 2022 that really helped me figure things out. I think my favourite one being The Mountain Is You, but back in March I read a book about change and why it's a good thing. This being important at the time because I was going through a breakup, which sounds comical in the video, but yeah, that helped me a lot. These books are not relevant to the video. I'm more so trying to get at the show and movie and future kind of give me ideas to further research upon, and then when I did, I found these books, and hopefully I can do the same for you. Going beyond that, I spent most of 2022 researching about attachment styles and how I can resolve my issues, and I'm not there yet. I'm working on it. But that entire idea of being a work in progress is why I like Future so much. Speaking of which, Steven Universe Future has a lot to unpack when it comes to heavy topics such as trauma, relationships, and especially the idea of self-sabotage. I rewatched a lot of Future for the video, and it still hits me as deep as it did before. In the opening episode, we get a show off between Steven and Jasper, and I love it so much. It again shows Steven's character and how he has an innate need to help people, but then there's Jasper, who is just opposed to Steven in every imaginable way, and Jasper is just really blunt and says it all to Steven at one time.
You think everyone needs help, but it's only you.
And Jasper calls Steven out in a really cathartic way, in my opinion. Cathartic in that she was saying what everyone was thinking the entire time. Steven's entire overarching character arc is about helping others, and him trying to help people who don't want help just ends up damaging him because they live rent-free in his head. And whenever he can't help anyone, he lacks purpose. Throughout Steven Universe Future, I found Steven to be low-key unlikable. He tries to make himself useful by helping when it just isn't needed. This aspect of his character being seen in Little Homeschool Guidance, and it comes to a head and everything's fine. I already talked about Jasper's character when I talked about the original show, but Jasper brings out a different side in Steven that was never explored before, letting out his emotions via fighting. In his and Jasper's conflict in Little Homeschool, you can audibly hear and see Steven get to a breaking point, and you could hear his ego coming through, because he saved the entire galaxy, and the fact that there is one person out there who doesn't like him eats him up inside and keeps him from growing.
Fault! All the other devs were corrupted by the time they don't need to fight a war that's been over for years!
Throughout the entire season, Steven is really tested, like in Bluebird whenever the show takes the piss out of Steven for talking about love ad nauseum.
Friendship and joy and love and...
Wowie wow! He is so annoying!
I hate him so much.
Which is ironic because he spent the entire episode questioning himself for being cautious, and it's kind of funny because he forces himself into forgiving the two, when he really didn't have to because he was traumatized by them. And at the end of the episode, Greg compliments Steven on sticking to his principles and says that everyone is capable of change, but not everyone wants to change, which is really important. I was raised to believe the best in everyone and to be patient, and it kind of sucks because I've seen it in my relationships where I deal with a comical amount of crap because I'm constantly doing emotional labor to justify their actions towards me. Not everyone treats other people like how you treat other people. Not everyone thinks like you. And not everyone wants to change. This video could go on for a comically long time if I went into depth on every Steven Universe Future episode, so I'm not going to analyze everything, but Future has a much more melancholic tone than the original show and the movie. It explores Steven's immaturity and highlights his mental decline. This being showed in Little Graduation where he isn't letting everyone grow, even if they grow apart. Then in Prickly Pears, Cactus talks about how Steven needs to feel needed, because Steven throughout his entire life has always had a giant goal to work towards, and the idea of there not being anything to work towards is terrifying to him, as he no longer has a purpose. After Prickly Pear, which kind of serves as a mid-season finale, it gets a lot more depressing, which we see straight after in Dreams. In Dreams made me really uncomfortable when I first watched it. It's Steven's desperate attempt to keep everyone in his life after everyone's kind of left him, and everything plaguing his brain is gradually appearing to him in his dreams. This ultimately leads to a heart-wrenching scene of him trying to reach out to Peridot and talking about everything going on internally. One of the most heart-wrenching lines being,
I don't think I know how to be a friend without something to fix, but I just can't do it anymore. I'm so tired. Now I'm even doing it in my dreams. I'm sorry, I can't do this for you. Please don't leave. Don't leave.
Also, him commenting on the fact that everything is happening to him in his dreams too is pretty telling, because a majority of those with PTSD experience nightmares. I'm not saying that I have PTSD, but I used to consistently have really dark dreams, and I used to wake up drenched in sweat or crying. It happens less now because I've worked on it, and this sounds really stupid, but I only worked on it after watching Steven Universe Future, because I realized how impactful having those dreams were. From experience, I can tell you that you're not resting, you're just continuing to stress in your dreams, and it's terrible. I love how the episodes in Future go up and down and you believe that Steven is getting better, but in the long term it continues to get worse. It's kind of indicative of real depression, where you can have short bursts of being happy, but overall you're still declining. This happening here, you believe that Steven is getting better, then not long after that, you've got Together Forever where that is the most second-hand embarrassment I've ever felt in my life. Steven as a character is lost and without purpose compared to Connie, who has planned out everything, this leading him to have an unhealthy codependent relationship with Connie, because he sees Connie as his future. He definitely didn't think everything through, and he was incredibly naive and unrealistic. But he was scared of losing Connie too, so he tried to keep her in his life by binding the two by marriage, which backfired in Connie being freaked out. The reason why it flopped was because Steven doesn't even know what he's doing as his own person, so going into a marriage won't fix him. I also just completely forgot that they're like 17 and not ready to get married yet. Steven's entire life has been traumatic, and the amount of things that he's been through that just went completely unaddressed is crazy. And the way Growing Pains changes everything is some of the best writing I've ever seen in a show. Everything that would have been played off as comic relief in the original show comes to a head here, where it's spelled out that Steven's trauma is giving him PTSD, which again hits hard because incidents that go unaddressed when you're growing up don't go away. And whenever Connie's mum was talking about that, I had an epiphany and realised why I was having panic attacks so frequently. Steven's character keeps repeatedly going downhill in this season, and that's explored whenever his self-destructive episode allows him to spiral and to gradually cut everyone out of his life. His dad, the gems, he leaves everyone and goes to the diamonds for help. And if the diamonds could even change for the better, what is wrong with Steven? Yellow went from being this totalitarian leader to fixing everything she did wrong. Not actually, but she's making amends, okay? Blue's now a stoner and thought that forcefully making Steven happy was gonna fix him, but no. With White Diamond, the interpretation is up to the individual, but on my first watch I thought Steven was insinuating that he wanted to complete suicide, as in his head he is making White smash her head into a wall, which would have shattered her gem, but he only slammed his own head into a wall. So was he trying to shatter himself? It's kind of up to interpretation, but canonically he tried to shatter White as a way of getting revenge, which is a total backtracking of his own character, as he was vehemently against shattering.
And maybe I've had a not so nice thought or two about, like, you know, slamming White Diamond's head through a pillar.
His morals are gradually falling apart as he himself spirals more and more. Steven's character has been questioned in future, as it isn't completely reflective of how he acted when he was younger, this being a larger critique of future itself, but I found it to be relatable, and Steven's character is more accurate to a manic, depressive episode, because you have the Fragments episode, and then Homeworld Bound, then in Everything's Fine, Steven pretends everything is fine. That episode especially was so painstakingly relatable, as I have had long periods where I went through life pretending like everything was fine, when internally I was imploding. Then Steven and Everything's Fine can't go through life as normal, as his mental state is impacting his interactions with everyone else, and it's called out by his family, which again hurts to watch, as it's relatable to anyone who's gone through a similar thing. The ending scene of Everything's Fine when Steven is cornered in his house and has a meltdown is impactful because it shows a twisted sense of self-awareness, and while the way he describes his situation isn't entirely correct, the nuance here is that when you've got such a low self-image of yourself, you're going to negatively hinder how you describe yourself. Steven describes himself as someone whose problems don't matter over anyone else's because that's been shown time and time again over the show. Then we have the finale of Future, which is Steven being a monster. I Am My Monster doesn't have that much substance, to be honest with you. Then after that, Steven leaves to go find himself. I find the idea of Steven leaving in Future to be much more impactful. With everything Steven went through growing up, he was mangled between being a human or being a gem, and him leaving both to be on his own for a while and find himself is important because he never really got the time to find himself, and he was forced to grow up young. Therefore, it's pivotal that he got space. In my opinion, Steven Universe the franchise tackles emotion in a nuanced way. In the original show, we watch Steven grow up in a chaotic environment, and Steven is shown to be exemplar in how he handles conflict. He brings together his family time and time again after they fight, and we're led to believe that it's healthy, that he's the one who does all the emotional labor. Bear in mind, he's like 13. We watch him rapidly mature throughout the series because he has to, and it's portrayed like a good thing. He takes everyone's baggage and rarely puts himself first. The only reason he could somewhat deal with the diamonds was because he spent his entire life dealing with his own immature family. Whether it be Amethyst, who was also young and subjected to the same as Steven, Pearl being a whiny baby who's got Stockholm Syndrome, or Garnet, who appears to be a mature sound leader, but she was barely knowing what she was doing either. At the end of the original show, we're led to believe that everything is fine due to the ending. However, the diamonds still go unpunished for their crimes, and there are plenty of loose plot threads, but Steven's character arc is mostly complete. Enter the movie, where Steven realizes that Pink's arrogance led to her hurting Spinel, and him realizing that the damage that Pink did won't simply be solved by Steven mandating peace across the galaxy. There will always be more work to do. Then in a future where everyone Steven's helped has figured out their new purpose and everyone is growing while Steven is stagnant because his character growth was reliant on him helping those around him. So he kind of manufactured situations where he would need to be there to help. He needs to feel needed. In future, the comic relief scenes in the original show are switched completely and shown in a new light. Steven is in this self-destructive episode because of his chaotic upbringing, and it's impressive because in the end he still forgives the gems and their relationship is still there. I find there to be nuance in how the diamonds were handled. Yes, they committed the most egregious crimes imaginable, but there was a reason why it was never shown, and we barely saw Homeworld. It may have been down to the Crewniverse rushing it, but as I mentioned before, I interpret everything with Homeworld and the diamonds to be a metaphor for abuse that was purposely hyperbolic for the purpose of getting the audience to hate the diamonds, as it was morally inexcusable, whereas other actions can be rationed. I want to elaborate on this point. If you made the diamonds do a crime that wasn't egregious or overly disgusting, people would begin to argue whether or not it was actually a bad thing to do. So from a writing perspective, if you want the entire audience to be on the exact same page, you would have to make the diamonds do something really bad, which the writers did, and everyone did hate the diamonds. For everyone saying that Steven forgave the diamonds, no, Steven rather made peace with them. You can tell that in the movie and in future that Steven only goes to the diamonds for a last resort. I think it's easiest to explain it as low contact, rather than no contact, which if you've dealt with an abusive family, going low contact can be healthier than going no contact. It depends. I find it eye-opening that when I was younger, I idolized how Stephen dealt with conflict. He was always seeking peace among chaotic and dangerous environments, and I saw that as relatable, as I felt as if it matched similar experiences that I've been through. I found it commendable that throughout everything Stephen had been through, he still came out stronger on the other end, and I felt that if Stephen could get through it, so could I. I went through a really bad rough patch at the end of 2019, and I don't remember what exactly went wrong. It was an accumulation of problems, and I didn't really have an out. Being 100% honest with you, I got the feeling that I wouldn't be doing exams that year of school, and part of me thought that it was because I wouldn't be here. I didn't do exams that year for a different reason, but come to the end of 2019, Steven Universe Future came out, and it was comforting to have a show about this genuinely benevolent character who was going through their own rough patch, and it was comforting because it showed me that a happy ending didn't exist, and there are repercussions to Steven's mentality. I got better during 2020 because I had time to reflect and met new people, some good and some bad. 2021 was looking to be one of the best years of my life, and I felt as if I was on top of the world. By proxy, I got complacent and entitled, and whenever that happens, things go wrong, and that reminded me of the movie, which sounds cringy, but I'm not going to go into detail for the sake of privacy, but the difference between me in 2019 and me in late 2021 was that I had better people around me and I had better coping mechanisms. 2022 has been so eye-opening for me as the experiences I've had as a human being have made me much more socially aware and conscious. It started where 2021 ended, and I'd randomly be in school crying, and I remember being in the bathroom and breaking down one time, but that changed. Another thing I learned from 2019 was that feeling your emotions were really important. Suppressing them just prolongs the pain and makes you dump it on everyone else subconsciously. So I took the first few months of 2022 very slowly, and sure, every once in a while I felt comically terrible, but that feeling became more and more inconsistent, which is amazing, and I feel way better now. 2022 in retrospect ended up being one of the best years of my life, as I finally began to accept the ebbs and flows of life and expand my horizons. And this sounds so corny, but watching Steven Universe was crucial to me understanding this at a younger age, and the older I get, the more I understand this piece of media.